All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our virtual event space. My name is Allie, and I'm your host for this evening. And I'm so excited to be introducing Mike Fitz and Stacey Schmeidel here to discuss Mike's book, The Bears of Brooks Falls. So before we get into the fun stuff, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in. As much as we miss having you all in the bookstore, it has been such a delight to expand this online program and connect with readers and authors in a virtual space. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for buying books. Your support really is what makes all of this possible. So I will be linking books in the chat all evening, so it'll be super easy to find them. For those of you in the Seattle area, come on in. All three of our locations are open, or you can place an order online and come pick them up in store. Or if you're not local, we do ship. We are so grateful for your support. While you're over on our website, I definitely encourage you all to check out some of our other upcoming events. We have an exciting roster coming up over the next few months, as you potentially saw in our little slideshow there. And of course, if you would like to stay in touch with our community, you can sign up for our newsletter. It's a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs and blog posts. And of course, you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. So we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be at the top or the bottom of your screen. It is different than the chat box, which is great for virtual applause and connecting with each other. So please do let us know where you're from or your favorite latest read. But when it comes time for questions, do make sure that those end up in the Q&A so that we can most easily find them. And finally, there are auto-generated closed captions available from the menu at the top or bottom of your screen. Select the live transcript button to enable or disable them. And I believe that that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Mike Fitz, a former National Park Service ranger at Katmai and several other national parks, and the resident naturalist with explore.org. His book, The Bears of Brooks Falls, tells the story of Brooks Falls and the bears that made it famous, including an ecological history of the region, a deep dive into the wildlife along the Brooks River, and explores the human impact, both positive and negative, on this region and its wild population. And in conversation tonight, I'm so happy to welcome Stacey Schmeidel, a college public relations officer and bear advocate who has volunteered at several national parks, including Katmai National Park. Her love of bears and of national parks was sparked by the Bearcams on explore.org, which I believe we may get to see a little glimpse of tonight. So thank you both so much for being here. I am so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, of course, give me a shout, and same goes for all of you in the audience. I will be in chat. And with that, I'm going to pass the stage off to our authors. So welcome, both of you.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks to everyone at Third Place Books for giving me, this opportunity to share my book with everyone. So it's a great bookstore. If you haven't been there in the Seattle area, please do check it out. When I was living in the Upper Skagit Valley, I had the fortune of visiting the store. So yeah, it's definitely a wonderful place to visit. And my name is Mike. I'm the author of The Bears of Brooks Falls, Wildlife and Survival on Alaska's Brooks River. My co-host for this talk about the book is Stacey Schmeidel. She is someone that you can find driving the webcams occasionally if you're watching the webcams at Brooks River in Katmai National Park, Alaska. She's also been to Katmai as a volunteer as well, so she knows the area very well. And I'm really glad that she's here to help facilitate this conversation. So thanks so much, Stacey.
Oh, well, thank you, Mike, for being here and for taking the time to talk to us about this wonderful book, The Bears of Brooks Falls. I can see that we have nearly 100 people here already tonight, and I can see that we have people from multiple time zones and multiple countries, and so we are all eager to hear you talk about your book. I think for format, what we'd like to do tonight is I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you about the book. But the best part, I think, will come from audience questions. So we want to leave a lot of time in this presentation for audience questions. I see that one person already has submitted a question to the Q&A, so please keep those questions coming. But I'll kick things off with this question. So Mike, you're a former National Park Service ranger, and you've spent a long time living and working at Katmai National Park. You're now the in-house naturalist for explore.org. Can you tell us what inspired you to write this book, and who were you writing it for?
Well, simply put, I thought there was a story to tell. So that was part of the inspiration. But I understand that, you know, Katmai is a remote place. It's expensive to get to. It's difficult to get to. There's a lot of barriers that prevent people from visiting it in person. And I wanted to share that story of this place, a place that I really do love very much, with people. And I thought a book was a wonderful way to do that. The bears and their stories are incredibly inspiring. The park itself is very inspiring. And also it's interwoven also with a larger story of kind of like the national park idea and the conservation history associated with national parks. So I wanted to write it to share those tales. And I also wanted to inspire people to care more for this place. So I tried to write the book and hopefully wrote it in an engaging manner so people will walk away from it thinking, hey, you know what, that is a pretty special place. And maybe I'm going to pay a little bit more attention to the parks in my region or the fate of, you know, bears and salmon in other parts of the world.
So when you were writing this, were you writing for people who have already been to Brooks Camp, or for people who might visit Brooks Camp, or does somebody have to know Brooks Camp to appreciate this book?
I certainly hope they don't have to know Brooks Camp to appreciate the book. I mean, you can get to know the area through the webcams if you don't have the opportunity to visit in person. But I was really trying to write for both audiences, which is kind of tough. But the majority of people who are buying the book haven't been to Brooks River. I mean, Brooks River really only gets the past couple of years, 14,000 people, you know, per year, which isn't a lot in the scheme of things when you're thinking about national parks overall. So I wanted to write the book more for the audience who maybe is watching on the webcams, or people who are just interested in wildlife and national parks. Because I love books that are about, you know, kind of people's experiences in places and about the ecology of those areas. So those are the types of books that I try to seek out, and this is you know, my attempt to maybe emulate that.
Great, great. The book does draw a lot on your personal experience, but there's also clearly a lot of research as well. Can you talk about your research process?
Well, I didn't actually understand that I was researching for a book when I first started doing research about Katmai, because I went there to be a park ranger back in 2007. So my main motivation was just to satisfy my own curiosity. And then also to make sure that I was being a good ranger for the public. So I mean, the public expects rangers to know everything about the park, which is kind of an impossible task, but we strive, you know, when I was a ranger, I did strive to meet it. So it was a lot of personal observation at the river, being fortunate enough to be there on a daily basis throughout many summers and watching the bears in person, and then kind of pairing that experience with you know, reading through the scientific literature to understand what has been described, and then that would help me to understand what the behavior of the bears or the biology of the bears even better. And then I also have had the fortune in my life to run into and get to know a few really great naturalists, and a few of those folks, you know, they didn't directly tell me to do this, but just kind of getting to know them, I understood over time that if I want to remember anything, I got to write stuff down. So anytime I'm at Brooks River, even when I'm outside at home, I carry a lot of these little Write in the Rain notebooks. And just to get, I'll just open to a random page here, but just to give people a glimpse of the scribbles in there. I don't know if you can actually see that, but I write very small, mostly for the economy of space, and that I don't want people reading over my shoulder if I'm at like the wildlife platform watching the bears at Brooks Falls. But that has really helped me to not only remember stories, but also recall details that perhaps I would forget otherwise. And relying on those notebooks has really helped. It helped in the formation of the book overall. So it was a combination of a bunch of different things. But yeah, continuing to research, it's really fun to get to know the wildlife, and really fun to keep try to stay in touch with the science, the evolving science of bears and conservation.
I have to say, as somebody who has tried unsuccessfully to read over your shoulder on the Brooks Falls platform, I find your notebooks fascinating, and I find that process fascinating. And I want to thank you for kind of sharing that with people. Your handwriting is tiny, and someday I hope that you give those notebooks to someplace where we'll all have a chance to look at them, because that would be fascinating reading as well.
I've had people comment and say that it's kind of like old-timey writing. And we're like, oh, dear Mabel, it's hard being away across the continent. But, you know, someone writing from the Klondike or something like that. But
That's
maybe one day.
That will be the sequel, the Bears of Brooks Falls Part 2. So I wanted to ask you, when you went to Katmai for the first time, which was in 2007, I think, you were like a volcano guy. You went for the geology. At what point did you fall in love with the bears?
That was, yeah, volcanoes kind of were my initial interest when I had the opportunity to go to Katmai National Park. I had worked at Mount Rainier prior to that, so I thought that was an amazing place. I worked at Death Valley the previous winter, and Death Valley has basically everything like a geology geek could want, including some recent volcanic features. So I was really eager to see volcanoes that are more active on average. And the Katmai National Park is the site of the largest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, the largest in the last 200 years on Earth. So it has some amazing volcanic resources. It really was within, I'd say, probably a couple of weeks of bears starting to arrive at Brooks Falls that I really started to fall in love with the bears. Going to the wildlife viewing platforms, and I was always interested in animals and watching animals, but I never had the opportunity to observe wild animals closely in person on a day-to-day basis and get to know them specifically as individuals. So I had the good fortune of talking with the bear biologist at the time, Tammy Olson, and talking with the bear monitor at the time, and learning about the bears from their perspectives. And then I would go back. I remember my girlfriend at the time and now wife, we would go back to the ranger station after the falls platform closed in the evening, and we would leaf through initially like the bear monitoring notebooks and get to know a little bit more about those bears, because there wasn't anything really kind of consolidated about the bears except for those notebooks. And we were like, oh, we saw that guy. Oh yeah, we saw 410. Oh yeah, we saw Ugly. Oh yeah, we saw Otis. And then I started to realize, once I internalized some of that information when I was talking to the public about the bears, it was so easy to talk to people about the bears, because all I had to say was something like, hey, that's number 410. She's one of the oldest bears on Brooks River, and this is, I think, her 4th litter. And it just really opened up the floodgates for questions about the animals itself. So, and then, you know, going back to the individuality of the bears are so adaptable, they're so smart, they're so intelligent. It was really, really fascinating to watch these bears and get to know them kind of on a personal level, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that has struck me about the book, and that has struck a lot of us who are reading the book, is kind of this mix of the science, right? The data. The book is a guide to Brooks River and its inhabitants, and it's a guide to salmon and bears and climate, and there's a lot of science and there's a lot of data. And at the same time, it does have stories about a lot of individual bears. Why was it important to kind of mix those things? Why was it important to have the science and the stories?
Well, like I mentioned before, those are kind of like the types of books that I enjoy. So I guess I was mimicking some of my, my favorite authors, things like people like Bernd Heinrich, for instance, or, even going farther back in time with like Rachel Carson. Her prose is so wonderful, even though the science of what much of what she has written about has changed. When I was writing the section about salmon in particular, I was really trying to channel my inner Rachel Carson to bring the lives of those fish out for people. So I enjoyed those books, but for better or for worse, the stories of individuals, I think, resonate with people more strongly than than stories about populations. And wildlife biologists and managers, they really kind of hate it. Within my experience, when I've had conversations with them about it, they're like, oh no, well, we manage, we're managing the population. We want to make sure that it's, it's sustainable and it's healthy, and that's great, and that is their job and their duty, and it's a worthwhile vocation, and that's what they have to shoot for. But I have found that individual stories help to kind of bridge those gaps between what people resonate with and helping to care for like the larger bear population. So when I write about a mother bear like 273 and her cub, or Grazer and her cub at the river, that helps people to understand sort of like the larger world of mother bears and some of the challenges that and experiences that they have in their daily lives. And when you pay attention to politicians, they're doing the same thing. Although I would probably be an insult if you did call me, a political type, but they'll do that too. Like, oh, I was in, average town America, and I talked to Joe Schmo, and he's experiencing this difficulty, and I'm gonna make it right. They're not talking about like people overall. They're just talking about that individual and thinking, well, hopefully some of the voters out there will, will agree with me on this stance. So it's kind of a form of rhetoric, but the stories overall of the bears are fascinating too. So and that's a unique thing about the wildlife watching experience at Katmai National Park and through the webcams, is you get to know these individual animals. They're not anonymous individuals on the landscape, and I think that's just a fascinating thing about the experience.
I loved the individual stories that you told in the book. As a Bearcam viewer, I knew many of the bears that you were writing about, but I think even if I didn't know those bears, so many of those stories are stories of resilience and triumph and kind of ingenuity. And I think even if I didn't know those individual bears, I would have appreciated that. It's 20 minutes after, and I just want to remind everybody who's here tonight that we want to get to your questions too. There are a number of questions that have been submitted, but if you have a question and you haven't submitted it yet, please put it in the Q&A section down at in the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I have a couple of more questions for you, Mike. Before we get to the viewer questions, I wanted to ask you, the title of the book is The Bears of Brooks Falls, but the first 3 chapters have nothing to do with bears, and they aren't on the river at all. Why was it important to start the book the way that you did, away from bears and away from the river?
One of the themes that I tried to incorporate into the book was, kind of like an idea about Brooks River in the larger sort of story of national parks. So the origins of like the modern sort of conservation history of Katmai National Park, in a sense, is catalyzed by the 1912 volcanic eruption of Nova Rupta volcano. And I thought that story is kind of fascinating. It's always been fascinating for me to go into the landscape that was created by that eruption, the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, and explore it. And not only read, about the science of it, but also read the 1922 book by Robert Griggs, where he talks about, his discoveries in the valley and kind of retrace his steps. So that story, I wanted to put that story in there because I think it helps to maybe understand how the national park evolved over time and how Brooks River and the facilities there and the experience for people there have evolved over time, which is something that I try to include toward the end of the book. So that tale at the beginning of the formation of the park, I thought was an important foundation. Originally, though, I had envisioned a larger sort of scope for the book itself. And I talked to a developmental editor just about my ideas. And he was like, well, if your audience is going to be mostly interested in bears, then your book should be really focused on bears. So, and he was right about that. So I kind of pared down a lot of my ideas, but I didn't cut that beginning section because I thought it was so important to kind of set the stage for what people thought Katmai National Park could be in the future, and to maybe consider what it is now.
It's a wonderful section. There's another section that is not about bears, and that's the middle section about salmon. why is it important to talk about salmon in a book about the bears of Brooks Falls?
Salmon are the keystone, the bedrock of the place itself. It's hard to overstate how important they are to not only the bears. I mean, we wouldn't have bears fishing at Brooks Falls. And if you're not familiar with the spot, hopefully you are, but the picture behind me is of Brooks Falls. They're not there because they like to stand in water. They're there because that's where they make a living. That's how they can catch fish, and that's how, you know, one of the ways that they get fat to survive winter hibernation. So the salmon are extremely important to the population of bears that inhabits Katmai National Park, and they're also you know, incredible animals in their own right. To think about what they endure through their lives, the risks that they take, how so few of them will survive overall out of the, you know, several thousand eggs that a female lays. Maybe just a few of those will survive to have the opportunity to return to fresh water. And throughout their whole entire lives, they are just hammered by predators. As soon as they come out of the gravel, there's stuff looking to eat them. So they are almost never free in their whole entire lives of that threat of predation. And that's something that's, you know, typically so different from people. So I tried to, you know, when I'm watching salmon, to think about things from that perspective, what it would be like to be trying to make a living, being a predator like a salmon, eating, you know, plankton, for instance, and krill out in the ocean, but at the same time trying to avoid things like orcas and seals, salmon, sharks, and then being in fresh water and trying to swim upstream without eating, and fueling basically your entire migration and spawning efforts just on the energy stores within your body. And sometimes being in fresh water for several weeks to sometimes a couple of months or more without eating, and then spawning at the same time. And then there's that whole story of them spawning and then dying. Salmon are anadromous, and they born in fresh water, they go to the ocean to grow big, they come back to fresh water to spawn, and then they die. That's it. So they lead incredible lives, Odyssean lives in a sense, and then they're the heartbeat of like the culture of the area. Not only like the settler culture, but also the indigenous cultures as well. They're the heartbeat of the economy. And when you look at, especially, you know, at the state of salmon elsewhere in North America, it's not great in most places. The Pacific Northwest, California, the salmon runs in a lot of places are doing terrible, to be honest with you. A lot of those runs are threatened or endangered. Some of them are completely dependent on humans for their continued existence. Where I'm living now in northern Maine, you know, Maine used to have substantial runs of Atlantic salmon, and that's just not the case anymore. They're just hanging on by a thread even here. So I wanted to also highlight, you know, kind of like a perspective on a place, an ecosystem that's functioning at its fully realized potential. There's so many, you know, doom and gloom stories about environmental degradation in the world. But Brooks River, Katmai National Park, the Bristol Bay area overall is like a bright beacon and kind of a world of gloom in a lot of ways. And we have to work to protect it too. Climate change could certainly affect the phenomenon that we love at Brooks River. It could disrupt the salmon run, disrupt the economy there. And then, you know, large scale mining too. I wanted to highlight that. That is a significant threat to salmon in Bristol Bay. So we have to work to make sure that those things don't come to pass and we lose our salmon like we did elsewhere. So yeah, I thought salmon was worth the time for sure. And maybe even just 3 chapters probably isn't enough.
Well, another book then. The final section of the book, I want to say it is an incredible ecosystem. The Brooks River watershed at Bristol Bay. The final section of the book focuses on the human impact on the Brooks River. And humans are, I guess, a part of that ecosystem. When I read that final section, I found myself thinking not only about the human impact on Brooks River, but more broadly about the human impact on wildlife and in other national parks. And so I wonder, to what extent should we extrapolate about our relationships with the national parks from what's happening on Katmai? Is that a reasonable thing to do, or should we avoid that?
No, I think we should. I think we should think about what's happening at Brooks River, the the issues that it's experiencing now, the issues that it experienced in the past, and think about how that compares to other national parks. Because, you know, what happens at Brooks River has largely mirrored sort of like the management style and the conservation of national parks over time. And let's see here, at the very beginning of my epilogue, I have a quote. It's maybe the only poll quote or block quote that I have, you know, maybe in the book, but it's from a former national park superintendent, Ray Bain. He was superintendent at Katmai National Park from 1987 to 1990. And he made actually a comment on an article online about development at Brooks River. And I wanted to use that quote because it is, I think, so poignant. And so it's kind of says things so succinctly about what Brooks River can represent. And he says, the importance of Brooks River transcends Katmai National Park. It is perhaps the most iconic wildlife viewing site found with any U.S. national park. As such, its care sets a standard for both the national park system and the National Park Service. And yeah, in more words than that, I think I was trying to argue for that throughout those final chapters, because we can't separate humanity's influence from the river, from its bears, certainly. And over time, Brooks Camp and the tourist facilities there and how people experience that place has really changed. A lot of the early conflicts that happened between people and bears have been resolved, like conflicts over food, for instance. Bears used to feed on garbage there, just like they did at Yellowstone, just like they did at other national parks. There wasn't strong food storage regulations, but now over time, with stronger regulations that prohibit people from giving bears the opportunity to associate people with food, and then also with a change in culture, not only in like park staff and concession staff there, but also just with the public as well, thinking, hey, you know what, we got to maybe give these bears just an opportunity to feed on wild foods and things will be better for them and us. So they kind of solved that problem there, but there's other issues that haven't been resolved, such as, you know, conflict over space. I think that's one of the greatest challenges that park managers are grappling with at Brooks River right now. This year at Brooks River, even though there's fewer rangers, it may have record numbers of visitation. So it's extremely challenging for the rangers to manage those that situation right now, and the crowding issues associated with you know, Brooks River and the people that visit there. It's not unique to Katmai, and I think the National Park Service has kind of seen the writing on the wall about this for a couple of decades, and they've been a little slow to address it, unfortunately. And I hope they kind of get their act together, in a sense, park service wide, and try to think of a different solution, because these places have finite carrying capacities, and many places are kind of reaching a tipping point and a threshold beyond which, you know, maybe the experience or the resources get overly degraded.
I want to jump to a question that a viewer has submitted, if that's okay, because
Sure.
it relates to what you've just said. Colleen says that she is a CAM viewer who just got back from her first trip to Brooks last month. And she says it would seem that the bears are becoming victims of their media success. Do you think it's time to start limiting day visitation? Also, P.S. please tell Otis that it's time to make an appearance.
All right.
What about limiting attendance? Is that something people should be looking at?
Well, it's something that has been proposed in the past for Brooks River, because there's only so many people that can fit on the wildlife viewing platforms, for instance, at Brooks River. There's only so much space in the rest of the facilities for people there. And there's already, I've always found it interesting that we accept de facto limits on overnight use in national parks. There's only so many campsites, for instance. There's only so many people that can stay in a campsite. There's only so many like lodge rooms and hotel beds, even in, you know, the most developed national parks. But day use has kind of been a taboo thing for a lot of park managers to even try to address. I think largely because of the political opposition that comes along with that. And I don't want to discourage people from visiting Katmai or other national parks, but as more and more people want to experience these spaces, I think you know, rangers are just kind of overwhelmed with the crowd. So we all have to take a step back and think about, you know, one, what do we want out of this experience, and two, is what we want maybe too much for the park itself, like its bears. So At the end of the book too, I try to outline some of the steps that people can utilize to have an ethical visit when you go to Brooks River. And thinking more about the needs of the animals and the things that make parks special, rather than like the wants that we have. I mean, it's so tempting to get a little closer to those bears, you know, to get a better photograph, but the bear needs space. We don't need the photograph. We may want it, but, you know, we're not going to die without, you know, without that photograph. The bears, you know, they need that space in the river to survive. So I think it's more about thinking about the needs of the animals. And if we can switch our mindset around, then we might be able to squeeze a few more people in. But definitely, yeah, I think it's time in a lot of places to consider what the carrying capacity of these facilities and the resources are.
I love that idea of kind of switching the mindset and trying to imagine, you know, what is the bear needing right now? Why is the bear doing that right now? I feel like watching the cams, seeing your play-by-plays, reading the book, all of those things help kind of expand our experience of the bears in a really wonderful way. I know that you've just gotten back from 2 weeks at Brooks Camp. What storylines did you see developing while you were there?
Yeah, it was great to be back. I didn't get there in 2020 due to the pandemic, so I spent a couple of weeks there helping rangers do live programs on explore.org. And I don't know if I should say this or not, but there's some things in my book that are already obsolete. And I knew that was kind of the risk in writing about some of the things that I did. But when I write about the bear hierarchy in the chapter called Living Large, you know, I write about 856, and he's been the river's most consistently dominant bear for about a decade. I mean, and that's a long time to reign at the top. He is a big guy, a tough guy, good fighter. And rarely would we ever see a bear challenge him. There were some exceptions when he was maybe injured one year, but for the most part, yeah, bears just got out of his way. And that changed this year with number 747, who is a giant. He is one of the largest brown bears on earth. No joke. I mean, if you're watching the webcams and you see him, you are definitely watching a bear that's probably in the top 1% of bears based on size in the world. So he's a huge bear. And he displaced 856 this year. So that storyline has changed a bit. And I always look forward to seeing how the hierarchy ebbs and flows throughout time, because this might be, you know, kind of 747's, you know, year to be, you know, at the very top of the hierarchy, but there's nothing to suggest that that's going to be like that next year. We could have, you know, 747 there, could be another bear, could be two bears that are kind of at equal levels, you know, at the top of the hierarchy. It doesn't have to be just one bear. There's no real alpha in that sense. And then I love watching, you know, the continuation of the stories of a lot of the experienced mothers at Brooks River, bears like Grazer, bears like Holly, who have cubs this year. Some of the new moms, I write about number 909 in the subadulthood chapter, and she's a mother this year. So she's no longer a teenage bear. She's come back as a mother bear. So she's not very prominent on the webcams. We've only gotten a few glimpses of her, but I'm interested to see how, you know, she navigates the world while trying to care for her cubs now that she's an adult bear. So there's all of those things. And then lastly, of course, the continuing, you know, evolution of the human relationship with Brooks River, and how that that evolves, and how, you know, park rangers and park managers are thinking about, you know, giving people a great experience, but also, you know, addressing, you know, the challenges of managing a national park when more people want to visit.
So I'm going to try to go quickly into screen sharing mode while I ask you, for people who maybe haven't seen the explore.org bear cams, I hope you are seeing them now.
Yeah, you may want to fill your screen there. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, you're seeing everything, aren't you?
Yep.
You know what? I'm just going to stop because I don't feel confident doing that.
Okay.
But tell us, Mike, what might people expect to see if they on the explore.org bear cams in the next few weeks or so?
Well, it's a great time to watch the webcams. It's one of the best seasons to watch the webcams. So if anybody wants to do that, you know, if you're not familiar with it, just go to explore.org right now. You'll be able to watch the brown bears live at Brooks River. It's it's kind of still prime time for bears fishing at Brooks Falls. The salmon migration, though, is tapering off right now. So this is about the end of the salmon migration period. And as that happens, salmon will disperse throughout the watershed, and consequently bears will disperse throughout the watershed following the fish. Early in summer, Brooks Falls and Brooks River is kind of where it's at for bears who want to fish for salmon. But in August, they have lots of other opportunities, so they'll go to those places. Although over the past few years, we've still seen some bears sticking around Brooks River. So I think we can expect to see that this year too. In September, though, really look forward to, and Stacey, I know you look forward to this, but the bears, they're just balloon. I mean, some of them are still kind of lean at this time of the year, but they'll just be these butterballs at the end of the year. Some of them, the large adults, can gain like 4 pounds of body weight per day eating salmon in September and October. I mean, just kind of incredible appetites, and that helps them survive winter hibernation. And so you can look forward to watching bears in September at Brooks River too, and October, and really kind of like the end of our season really is Fat Bear Week. And that's hosted by Katmai National Park and Explore.org, and you get to vote for who you think is the fattest Bearcam bear of the year. So that's something certainly to look forward to. But right now, watching the bears at Brooks River, it's great to watch. It's fun to watch, but they're also facing a lot of competition now. So when you're seeing the bears jostling for position at the falls, think about that as well. What is that bear facing in its daily life? And look for some of the bears that I wrote about in the book, like 747, like 856, and like Grazer, Holly. They're going to be at the river too.
People always say, what's the best time to watch the cams? What's the best time to visit Katmai? There's no bad time to watch the cams, and I think. I want to point out that the wonderful Allie has posted a link to the bear cams in the chat, so that makes it easy. I think it's probably time to turn to viewer questions. We have a number of questions that have been submitted already, but if you have a question for Mike, and if you haven't already submitted it, please submit it through the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. An anonymous attendee, Mike, asks, what's your favorite scene to witness at Brooks Falls?
It's hard to say. In the fall, I really kind of like watching just like a fat bear float through the river and doggy paddle, lazily, and just pick up one salmon after another. I also enjoy, early in the season too, seeing the bears coming back to the river for the first time and watching how they interact with one another. I find that just kind of to be a fascinating process to see some of the bears who are friendly with one another kind of reunite, because some bears do seem to prefer the company of others. So they can have almost, in a sense, like friendships where they're like, hey, I remember you. I remember what you smell like. I remember what you look like. And you were a cool person last year, or a cool bear last year. So let's play. And then they start wrestling. And then there's the big guys, for instance, that will come down and try to establish their dominance. And I love seeing those bears interact for the first time, to see how those interactions in the hierarchy play out over the course of the season. So those are a few things that I really enjoy watching.
Excellent. Susan wonders, this is a question about the beginning of the season. She says, do the bears have any sense when they come out of hibernation when the fish are arriving?
They probably have an intuitive sense of the right time of the year. I don't think they can predict it like on a daily basis, for instance, but they've learned through learned experience and probably some other cues associated with like, the greenery, like how green are the trees, maybe they associate it with the position of the sun in the sky, like with summer solstice. I'm not really sure, but certainly through learned experience, that's how they know about the time of the year when the salmon are going to arrive. And the bears at Katmai National Park have a pretty wide range of when they're going to emerge from their dens. With adult males, some of those could come out in early March, some of the earliest bears. Mothers with newborn cubs, most of those aren't going to come out of the den until May, and sometimes not even until early June. So they all kind of have an idea of when the salmon are going to arrive, and many times they can get it right. Maybe not on the same day, but certainly they arrive within the same week. And if they get there a little early, they'll come down, they'll kind of sniff around, they might sit in the waterfall for a while, and they'll just be like, there's no action today. and then they move on and see what else is going on, and then they'll come back.
A related question, Paula wonders, and this is, I think, related to the kind of developing storylines. Paula asks, she points out that this year's salmon run has been very different from previous years. Why do you think this has happened, and how are the bears adapting?
It's been interesting to see how relatively few salmon are moving through the river, given the overall strength of the Bristol Bay salmon run, and especially in the Naknek River. There was something like close to 2.4 million salmon or something like that entering Naknek River. And the Brooks River is just a small part of that watershed. In most years, seems like, at least from the data that was collected in the past, about 20% of those salmon will go through Brooks River. So last year, when there was an incredible run of salmon in Naknek River, about 4 million fish, Brooks River could have seen about 800,000 salmon moving through it. And Brooks River, if you're not familiar with the geography of it, it's only 1.5 miles long. And in many places, it's less than 50 yards wide. So it's not a very big stream, and it had 800,000 salmon moving through the river. It seems like all of July in 2020 was just a wall of fish moving through. This year, even though the salmon run overall was still very strong, it seems like there's relatively few fish moving through Brooks River. And I'm not sure why that is. But there was an interesting study that came out a few years ago from a different Bristol Bay watershed, and that was from the Nushagak watershed. And I think the lead author on that was Sean Brennan, I think, or Brennan. And they ended up finding that different parts of that watershed were productive in different years, even though the numbers of salmon entering the larger Nushagak River watershed was essentially equivalent or very strong. So kind of like this part of the watershed in a few years was very, very productive, while this other part wasn't doing so well, but then that productivity shifted over time. So that might be the case at Brooks River and the upper, Brooks River watershed. Perhaps, during the last several years, salmon productivity in that area hasn't been as strong as other parts of the Naknek River watershed. I'm not sure. That's my speculation right now, but it's a very strong run overall, and the bears know that there's other places to fish too, so they'll disperse to those locations. But that's my my best guess at this point.
Thank you. Here's another question that I think is maybe related. You've talked about this a little bit. Can you talk a little bit more about climate change? Megan wonders, has climate change started to affect the park watershed? How is it likely to impact the bears in future years?
It has started to impact the area for sure. Even within my experience at Brooks River, glaciers have significantly receded in Katmai National Park. I can see that when I visit the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, for instance. Looking back farther in time with historic photographs, you can see that vegetation, like tall vegetation specifically, like trees, has expanded on the mountains. It's the tree line is actually going up in elevation. It's expanding into the tundra in the lowlands of Bristol Bay. So those things have certainly happened. The waters of the North Pacific are also warming and acidifying, and also the fresh waters of the Katmai region are warming as well. Now, currently, it seems like the best available evidence suggests that little bump up in warming hasn't harmed the salmon. And in fact, you could argue that maybe it's benefited the salmon just because the runs are just bonkers over the last several years. In fact, this year was the largest salmon run on record for the Bristol Bay area, something like 63 million fish. So just amazing numbers of fish coming back to that area. But, the climate is going to continue to warm. We're not like holding it steady. We're definitely, probably going to pass a threshold beyond which the climate in Bristol Bay and the North Pacific is harmful to salmon, or at least less habitable for them. The ocean will probably acidify further. That could disrupt food webs, for instance. The freshwater conditions are likely to change the hydrology, with changing precipitation patterns and heat waves too. We experienced, record-setting heat waves, all-time record-setting heat waves in the Bristol Bay area in 2019, and that hasn't happened this year, thankfully. But that sort of weather events, they may become the norm by the end of the century, especially if we don't get our act together and address climate change. So all those politicians out there who are dragging their feet about it, man, you're really doing the future harm. So get your act together, and I won't be voting for people who don't take that issue seriously. But right now it's still a bright spot, but we got to work to protect it.
Leah wonders, aside from sharing your wonderful book, how can people who aren't going to Katmai helps to support the bears and maintain and save their ecosystem?
Well, certainly, yeah, making sure that your elected officials at all levels of government are aware that climate change is an issue and that they should act to work to mitigate it and reduce its impacts and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And then also one of the other best things to do, besides just spreading the word about this wonderful place, and thank you for sharing the book, by the way, is to support sustainable fisheries. The Bristol Bay salmon run and the fishery there is really the last great salmon run left on Earth, and it's managed very well. And the fisher people of the area buy into that. It's part of their culture. And there's so few fisheries on Earth where it's doing great for both people, the fish, and the wildlife that are dependent on whatever fish that they're trying to catch. So buy Bristol Bay salmon. That is one of the better things that you can do. Support that fishery, support that economy up there.
Mike, we are running out of time and we have a lot of questions left. Can we do like a speed round?
All right, rapid fire. Yeah.
Yeah. Kasha wonders, have you read any of Diane Ackerman's books?
The name is familiar, but I can't, off the top of my head, I can't recall.
Okay.
So I'd say no right now.
Allie might post a link in the chat. Leah wonders, which has been your favorite bear to observe and why?
Oh, that's a question that is a tough one to answer. This bear, though, no longer comes back to Brooks River. She's probably deceased. She was, in her late 20s when you saw her last. But I do really miss watching 410. And I read about her in the book too. And she was such a great bear, and it's tough to go back to Brooks River and not see her. I mean, she was just such a big part of my ranger experience there.
She lives on for many of us. I love this question. An anonymous attendee says, I noticed a bear asleep by the viewing platform and he was making little twitchy movements in his sleep, like a dog or cat. So this person wonders, do bears dream? And if yes, what are they dreaming about?
I bet they do, and I bet it's probably salmon. I wish we could get in their brains and know for sure, but they're just as smart as dogs. So I bet they have that capacity to dream.
I'd like to think so too, especially as we're talking about 410. Lori wonders, what was your favorite part of the book to write?
Oh boy. I enjoyed writing the part about the Valley of 10,000 Smokes for sure. I enjoyed the challenge of writing the end of the book and talking about the issues associated with the river. I really loved writing about like the hierarchy chapter, even though that one didn't come together for me as easily as possible. But that one was also really fun. And then, yeah, so those are three quick things that I can pull off the top of my head.
Excellent. Several people love the book and wonder if you're going to write a sequel.
I don't know, but my contract with Countryman Press has an option for future editions. So maybe, as I need to update it in the future, yeah, there's that option.
Good. Thank you. We look forward to that. Betsy wonders, she says, Mike, we just discussed your chapter on climate change in book club. And she wonders how we noticed that you end that chapter on a positive note. There's a lot of bad news about climate change, and yet you end that chapter on a positive note. How do you maintain your positive outlook for the future of Brooks and for the wider world?
Well, the people who know me well they may say, hey, Mike isn't always so positive about things. It's difficult at times, to be honest with everybody, because there, even when I go outside my home here, I see signs of a degraded environment. For instance, like the beech trees, you know, they're infected with beach bark disease. So they no longer reach like their potential on the ecosystem. And they were extremely important foods for wildlife in this area in the past throughout the eastern United States. So like invasive species, you know, you see those everywhere. It's really, really hard. But knowing that people care, and I'm not the only one kind of in this fight, I think that really gives me hope. And seeing even, you know, younger generations falling in love with nature and valuing it. Working with the Bearcam audience, you know, I never really had the opportunity to work and communicate with such a passionate, devoted group of national park advocates and brown bear advocates. So that really gives me hope. You know, if they're in this fight with me, then I can be right there with them.
We are in it with you. Relatedly, I think we have a question. Can Mike tell us about his involvement with Katmai Conservancy?
Yeah, actually, I am recently was accepted to be on the board of the Katmai Conservancy. So I apologize to my fellow board members on the Katmai Conservancy for not mentioning that. If, you know, somebody was asking earlier about what you can do to help the park. Well, the Katmai Conservancy is a great organization to support. We raise, you know, money to help fund projects and staff at Katmai National Park, things that maybe the federal government has trouble getting money for, specifically just because Congress isn't devoting the dollars to it. So you can join that or you know, become a friend of that organization. We'll do a fundraiser during Fat Bear Week this year. And the money goes, you know, towards Katmai National Park. It helps to support things like rangers on the ground, for instance, to give the bears greater levels of protection, and even some of the science about the bears in the park and other wildlife there. So yeah, check out katmaiconservancy.org.
Excellent, thank you. We have I just want you to know we have people with us tonight from Poland and Spain. There's somebody who wrote in from Thailand who says, I just wanted to let you know that I'm listening from Thailand. I've already finished the book and really enjoyed it. So you are spreading the gospel of the bears all over the world.
Thank you and welcome.
Kara wonders, she says, I love your stories about the bears. What is your favorite story from your time at Katmai?
There's a lot. It's hard, again, it's hard to choose one when you are fortunate enough to be around, you know, these bears so much. The quiet moments where maybe, you know, my wife and I are just standing on the wildlife viewing platform and pouring rain, and there's a dozen bears down below us, and we just get to watch that because everyone else is kind of cold, and you know, and they're going back to their rooms or their tents. I mean, those are certainly memorable for me. And then, you know, the unique stories of the bears too. The stories about like Divot, for example, who features in the boundaries chapter, and what park boundaries mean to wildlife and to people, and different cultures of people. You know, thinking back on that event and how we were able to help Divot, and now seeing her as a successful bear on the river. She has 2 cubs this year, 2 yearlings. And then also the story, which I didn't get in the book, and this is the one story that I really wish I could have incorporated into the book, and I didn't really kind of find a good spot for it. But that was the story of 503, how he was separated from his mother through sort of kind of like a normal separation process, but at a young age, uncommonly young as a yearling. And then him getting adopted by 435 Holly. And that whole story of that sort of blended family, and how unique that was to be able to witness in person. That's also a wonderful memory, and I don't think I'll ever forget having that opportunity to see that in person.
It is a wonderful story. A number of us have looked for it in the book. So maybe the next one, maybe. The next one. We are running out of time, and I fear that we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions. I do want to ask what I think is kind of an important question, which is, why do the bears of Brooks Falls matter? Why should people care about these bears?
I think they're a symbol of a healthy, you know, ecosystem and ecosystem functioning at their full potential. So when we see bears at Brooks Falls and Brooks River feeding on salmon, then we know there's kind of something right about the world. So, and I also think that their stories are ambassadors, or they can serve as ambassadors for bears overall. And I know, through my time watching bears at Brooks River, I've come to care more about bears in other populations and think more specifically about the issues that they face. Katmai's bears are very unique in the sense that they're allowed to live and die as wild bears. In other ecosystems, including the Yellowstone region, most bears eventually die, or I shouldn't say most, but many ecosystems, including the Yellowstone ecosystem, many bears die at the hands of people. So even though Yellowstone's a big national park surrounded by a lot of national forests, a lot of bears there are just dying because they come into conflict with people at some point in their lives. And that's something that's different for bears at Brooks River. But the bears at Brooks River, some of those stories translate out, and we can use those stories to think about what other bears are experiencing. And then also, going back to the story of the people of Brooks River and how that story is evolving and changing. And also, finally, maybe in a future edition of the book, to think more specifically about what that landscape means to indigenous peoples. I did talk about that in the boundaries chapter, but I thought about it since, and if I have to think about it, I probably didn't explore that idea enough. So that's also another place that we could think about. And also we can, when we're trying to think about the relationships of people with landscapes and national parks and in indigenous cultures, that's another reason to consider Brooks River a very special place.
You mentioned that the bears of Brooks Falls can serve as ambassadors for other bears. I wonder if they can also be like ambassadors for other animals and other ideas more broadly. Does that make sense, that question?
It does. For example, watching the bears and getting to know them at Brooks River as individual animals and writing about them, that has really opened my eyes up to the possibilities of what wildlife is capable of doing, and their intelligence, their sentience. I think before I went to Brooks River, I didn't really consider the sentience of wildlife that much, although I never denied it in my pets when I was a child. I mean, these are thinking animals in a sense. They don't conceptualize the world like we do, but they make decisions based on what they see in their environment. They're aware of their bodies. So I mean, that's fascinating to me. And I think we can take that away and look at other animals, and not in national parks, but even in your own backyard too. If you have a squirrel, or even, if you live in a city, those raccoons that are coming down and taking, garbage out of your trash can, hopefully not, but they probably are. If you live in a city, they're doing that somewhere. Or the coyotes that inhabit these urban spaces that have adapted to that landscape, and how they're able to survive, in these places. I mean, I think we can learn lessons from the bears and think about how that applies to animals in other habitats.
I think Allie is going to jump in and make us stop talking very soon. So I just, for everybody who submitted questions, thank you. And if the questions didn't get answered, I just want to, here's a quick one, Mike, before you go. Are you planning to, from a viewer in Argentina, are you planning to translate your book to other languages?
I haven't specifically made those plans, but that's a decision my publisher could make. It would be great if they did. And there's certainly, I think, a possibility for that to happen. It may just depend on interest from other people. So I would love for it to happen, but yeah, that's a decision that the publisher would have to make for sure. Hopefully, keep your fingers crossed.
We will keep our fingers crossed. A note to, if you did, to viewers, if you submitted a question that we didn't get to, I'm really sorry. And just a reminder that Mike and the Katmai Rangers do answer questions every Tuesday. Is it from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern?
5 to 7 Eastern, yep.
On the explore.org live chat page. If you just go to explore.org, if you go to Bearcam, you will be directed to that live chat where Mike answers questions every week. So feel free to keep the conversation going there. And Mike, I just want to thank you for, you talked about the bears being ambassadors, and I feel like you have created a whole generation of of ambassadors for the bears, first through your work as a ranger, and then through the CAMs, and now as a naturalist with explore.org, and through the book. You are inspiring people to care about bears, not just at Katmai, but everywhere. And so thank you so much for enriching our lives and broadening our world through the CAMs and through this wonderful book.
Well, thanks so much for that. And yeah, I feel very fortunate to be able to share this experience with everybody. When I started my career sort of like in public lands and conservation as an intern, you know, I back, I'm going to date myself, but back in 2000 and 2001, if you would have told me now I would be talking to people about wildlife on a webcam, I would have been like, that's nuts. What most people's internet is so slow you can't hardly open email. But here we are today in the future. Yeah, so it's yeah, I feel very fortunate to be able to share this experience with everybody and try to make you know, these places accessible to everyone around the world.
Thank you for that. I see Allie.
I'm back. Alas, the night is coming to a close. So before we say good evening officially, I just want to take a second to say thank you so much for all of you being here. Mike and Stacey, thank you for introducing me to the Bearcams, which is my favorite thing to do on the internet. This information is so important, and I think this window into Brooks River and the animals who are living there is so valuable to us and to people all around the world. If this chat box is any evidence. So for everyone in the audience, thank you so much for being here. If you'd like to get your hands on a copy of The Bears of Brooks Falls, go ahead and follow a link. I'm going to go ahead and put this link back in chat so you don't have to track it down. So there is that. Go ahead and follow that link. And of course, if you're local, come on in. Come let us know what you thought of this event, or of course, on social media. We love to hear from you anywhere. Mike and Stacey, one more huge thank you for being here. I just want to add that Third Place Booksellers have been really huge Fat Bear Week fans for years, years now. So this was a really exciting event for us. And with that, I think it's time to say goodnight. So shall we let the awkward waving commence?
Yeah, thanks so much for this opportunity, Allie, and visit Third Place Books, great bookstore, and thanks so much, Stacey, for being the MC tonight. Wonderful job.
Thank you. Thank you, Allie.
Thank you. Good
Thanks,
night,
Mike.
everyone.